Hollywood has always created immortality on screen. A face appears, lights dim, and stars feel larger than life for moments. But behind performances were real people who got sick, tired, lonely, or unlucky. Some died with family, others alone in hospitals, hotels, homes, or roads. Deaths were sudden or slow after long illness and suffering. Some endings remain mysteries Hollywood still cannot fully explain. They were human, fragile, and far from their on-screen images. Today we revisit final hours of 50 Hollywood legends. When the cameras stopped, their real stories ended quietly, leaving behind fame, memory, and unanswered questions forever. Vivien Leigh. Vivien Leigh's final hours were painfully quiet for a woman who had spent her career portraying some of cinema's most unforgettable survivors. By 1967, Leigh was only 53, but years of illness had taken a serious toll on her health. She had previously battled tuberculosis, and the disease had returned. Her personal life had also been marked by serious emotional struggles, even as audiences continued to remember her as Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind and Blanche DuBois in A Streetcar Named Desire. On the night of July 7, 1967, Leigh was at her London home with her partner, Jack Maravalli. She had gone to rest, but later Maravalli discovered that she had collapsed. Leigh had died from complications related to tuberculosis. She was just 53 years old. There was no dramatic Hollywood farewell, no camera capturing her final moment, and no audience watching the curtain fall. The woman who had played characters fighting desperately against collapse had quietly lost her own battle. Hollywood preserved Vivien Leigh's face forever, but her final hours revealed the fragile human being behind the legend. Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo's final hours were as private and mysterious as the life she chose to live after leaving Hollywood. After walking away from films in 1941, Garbo spent nearly 5 decades refusing the usual rituals of celebrity. She avoided interviews, rarely appeared publicly, and lived quietly in New York, far away from the constant attention that had once followed her everywhere. By the final years of her life, Garbo was suffering from serious health problems, including kidney disease that required regular dialysis. The woman who had once captivated millions with a single look was now living a much quieter existence, protected from the cameras she had spent so much of her life avoiding. On April 15, 1990, Easter Sunday, Greta Garbo died at New York Hospital at the age of 84. Reports attributed her death to pneumonia and renal failure. There was no grand Hollywood farewell and no final performance for the public. In many ways, that was exactly how Garbo wanted it. The world had spent decades trying to understand the mysterious woman behind the legend, but even in death, she kept her final moments private. Greta Garbo had turned her disappearance into part of her mythology, and in the end, she controlled her final scene by keeping the cameras away. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis's final hours came far away from the glamorous studio lots where he had once been one of Hollywood's most recognizable leading men. By September 2010, Curtis had already lived several different lives. He had been a young man from the Bronx, a Navy veteran, a major movie star, a comic performer, a dramatic actor, a painter, a father, and a survivor of personal struggles that followed him long after his greatest films. Audiences remembered him from Some Like It Hot, The Defiant Ones, Sweet Smell of Success, and many other films that proved he was far more than a handsome face. In his later years, Curtis dealt with declining health, but he remained connected to art and his memories of Hollywood. On September 29, 2010, he died at his home in Henderson, Nevada, after suffering cardiac arrest. He was 85 years old. His death was not sudden in the way young stars sometimes disappear, but it carried a different kind of sadness, the passing of an entire era. Curtis had watched Hollywood change around him while the image of his younger self remained frozen on movie screens. In the end, the handsome leading man became an old man who had outlived the world that created him. The camera remembered Tony Curtis forever, but time could not. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando's final hours marked the end of a life that had completely transformed American cinema. By 2004, Brando's health had declined significantly. The young actor who had once electrified audiences in a streetcar named Desire and on the waterfront was now an elderly man dealing with serious respiratory and other health problems. He had spent decades struggling with the enormous weight of his own fame, often distancing himself from Hollywood even while remaining one of its most influential figures. On July 1, 2004, Brando died at UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles at the age of 80. His final years had been marked by declining health, personal difficulties, and family tragedies, but his influence on acting remained enormous. Brando had changed the way performers approached emotion, bringing a natural, unpredictable quality to the screen that inspired generations of actors. Yet his final chapter was far removed from the powerful characters audiences remembered. He was no longer Stanley Kowalski, Vito Corleone, or Colonel Kurtz. He was simply an aging man whose body was failing. Hollywood had spent decades turning Brando into a legend, but his final hours quietly reminded the world that even the greatest legends eventually become human again. James Gandolfini. James Gandolfini's final hours were ordinary, loving, and devastatingly sudden. In June 2013, Gandolfini was in Rome with his teenage son, Michael, enjoying time together during a trip that was supposed to include sightseeing and a scheduled appearance. To millions of viewers, Gandolfini was Tony Soprano, the intimidating and deeply troubled mob boss who changed television forever. But away from the screen, those who knew him often described a much gentler and more private man. On the evening of June 19, 2013, Gandolfini suffered a medical emergency in his hotel room. His son discovered him collapsed and immediately called for help. He was rushed to a hospital in Rome, where doctors fought to save him, but they could not. Gandolfini died from a heart attack at just 51 years old. The contrast between the actor and the character made his death especially painful. Tony Soprano seemed powerful enough to survive anything, but James Gandolfini was simply a father spending time with his son when his life suddenly ended. His final hours were not a mob drama or a Hollywood spectacle. They were a family tragedy. The man who made Tony Soprano unforgettable left behind a legacy that changed television forever. Philip Seymour Hoffman. Philip Seymour Hoffman's final hours were a tragic ending for one of the most respected actors of his generation. By 2014, Hoffman had already built a remarkable career, moving effortlessly between intense dramas, dark comedies, and unforgettable supporting roles. His performances in Capote, The Master, Doubt, and Boogie Nights had established him as an actor capable of disappearing completely into his characters. But away from the screen, Hoffman had struggled with addiction for years, and his personal battle eventually returned with devastating consequences. On February 2, 2014, Hoffman was found unresponsive in the bathroom of his Manhattan apartment by a close friend. He was only 46 years old. Investigators determined that he had died from an acute mixed drug intoxication involving heroin, cocaine, benzodiazepines, and amphetamine. His death shocked Hollywood because Hoffman was still at the height of his creative career, with major projects ahead of him. There was no warning that could prepare audiences for the loss. The actor who had spent his life portraying damaged, complicated, and deeply human characters had faced his own private struggle away from the cameras. His final hours ended a career that still had so much more to give, leaving behind performances that continue to remind audiences of just how extraordinary his talent was.